a 12-year-old boy calmly confesses to murdering his classmate, it sounds like an open and shut case. But as detectives dig into his story, they realize the truth is far more twisted than they ever imagined. Secrets, lies, and shocking revelations turn this investigation into a race against time. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you stand for justice, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The gray skies mirrored the somber mood at the funeral of Alex Grayson, a boy whose life had been brutally cut short. The church pews were filled with tear-streaked faces, a community grieving the loss of an innocent child. Alex's framed photograph, showing his bright smile and sparkling eyes, sat at the altar, a cruel reminder of the vibrant life stolen from him. Lisa Grayson clutched her husband Richard's arm as the pastor spoke, her tear-stained face barely visible beneath a black veil. Richard's expression was a mask of quiet agony, his clenched jaw the only sign of the storm raging within. Friends and neighbors filled the space, their whispered condolences blending with the soft hymns playing in the background. Detective Sarah Blake sat toward the back with her partner James Carter. Their presence was both respectful and professional, a reminder to the Grayson family that the police hadn't given up on finding Alex's killers. Sarah scanned the room, taking in the mix of grief and outrage etched into every face. It was the kind of tragedy that left no one untouched. As the service ended, Lisa approached Sarah, her movements stiff and deliberate. Before Sarah could offer her condolences, Lisa's anguish spilled over into fury. "It's been weeks," Lisa said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and despair. "My son is gone, and all I have are your promises." Sarah hesitated, the weight of Lisa's accusation heavy on her shoulders. "Mrs. Grayson, I can't begin to imagine what you're going through, but I promise we're doing everything we can." Lisa interrupted, her voice rising. Are you really? Because my son is dead, Detective Blake, and every day that his killer walks free, it feels like he's being forgotten." James stepped forward, his calm demeanor and attempt to diffuse the tension. "We understand your frustration, Mrs. Grayson. Please believe us when we say we're working tirelessly." Lisa scoffed, tears streaming down her face. "Then why am I burying my child? Well, you have no answers." The confrontation drew the attention of the remaining mourners. Sarah felt a deep pang of guilt as she looked into Lisa's tear-filled eyes. "I can't give you the answers you need right now," Sarah said softly, "but I can promise you this: we won't stop until we get justice for Alex." Lisa shook her head, her anger subsiding into quiet despair. "Justice?" she whispered. "Do you even know what that means anymore?" As Lisa turned back toward her family, Sarah and James made their way to their car. The conversation lingered in Sarah's mind, Lisa's grief and anger cutting deeper than she cared to admit. James broke the silence. "She's not wrong to be angry." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice subdued, "but every lead we've had so far has gone cold. It's like chasing shadows." Before James could respond, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and answered, her brow furrowing. As she listened, "We're on our way," she said, ending the call. "What's going on?" James asked as Sarah started the car. "A boy's been brought into custody," Sarah said, her tone cautious. 12 years old. "He confessed to killing Alex." James blinked, his shock evident. "A 12-year-old?" Sarah nodded, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. "That's what they said." "We need to find out why." The drive to the station was filled with an uneasy silence. Sarah's mind raced with questions. Why would a child commit such a heinous act? Was the confession genuine, or was there something more sinister at play? James finally broke the silence. "You think he's telling the truth?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but a 12-year-old confessing to murder, it doesn't sit right with me." As they pulled into the station parking lot, the gravity of the situation settled over them. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Officers moved with purpose, their faces grim as they prepared for the interrogation ahead. Sarah and James stepped into the building, exchanging a final glance. Both knew the days ahead would challenge them in ways they hadn't yet imagined, and the answers they sought might only lead to more unsettling truths. The fluorescent lights in the precinct buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over the interrogation room. Detective Sarah Blake stood behind the one-way mirror, watching the boy seated inside. Max Turner just 12 years old, sat with a disturbing calm, his fingers idly fang patterns on the metal table. His appearance was as unremarkable as any other preteen, messy brown hair, a slightly oversized sweatshirt, sneakers scuffed from wear. But his demeanor was anything but ordinary. Doesn't look like a killer, James, Carter said, joining her at the glass. Sarah didn't respond immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on Max, who showed no signs of the nervous energy typical of someone his age in this situation. It's not about how he looks, Sarah finally said. It's the way he's sitting there, like he doesn't have a care in the world. That's what worries me. Sarah and James entered the room, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Max barely glanced up, continuing to trace imaginary shapes on the table. Sarah took the lead, pulling out a chair across from him, while James stood near the door. Max, Sarah began, her voice steady, but laced with concern. Do you understand why you're here? Max nodded, his gaze finally meeting hers. His dark eyes held an unsettling maturity, as if he had already accepted whatever consequences lay ahead. I killed him, Max said bluntly. Isn't that enough? Sarah leaned forward slightly. We need to know why, Max. What happened that day? He shrugged. I just wanted to see what it felt like, he said, his tone devoid of emotion. It wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. Sarah's stomach twisted at his detached confession. She fought to keep her composure, pressing for details. How did you know Alex? Were you friends? Max tilted his head, as if amused by the question. Not friends. He was easy to get along, too trusting. He leaned back, a small smirk playing on his lips. He deserved it. Sarah exchanged a glance with James, who frowned deeply. Max, James interjected, his tone firmer. You're talking about taking someone's life. Don't you feel anything? Guilt, sadness? Max stared at James, his smirk fading into a blank expression. Why should I? People die all the time. It's not like it's a big deal. The air in the room grew colder. Sarah leaned forward again. You're 12, Max. Where did you even get the idea to do something like this? Max didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at his hands, his fingers tapping out a rhythm on the table. It's just something I thought about for a while, he said finally. I wanted to know what it was like to be in control. The word control struck Sarah like a blow. She jotted it down in her notebook, her mind racing to connect dots that weren't yet visible. While Sarah stayed with Max, James went to interview Nathan and Evelyn Turner, Max's parents. They sat in a small meeting room, Evelyn clutching a tissue as Nathan paced the floor. This has to be some kind of mistake, Evelyn said, her voice trembling. Max isn't a bad kid, he's just troubled. He has a hard time making friends. Nathan stopped pacing and glared at James. We're here because of some ridiculous confession. Do you really think a 12-year-old is capable of murder? We're here to understand what led to this situation, James replied evenly. Does Max have a history of behavioral issues? Evelyn hesitated, but Nathan cut in. Sure, he's had some problems. What kid doesn't? But this is insane. He couldn't have done it. James pressed further, asking about Max's school life. Evelyn admitted that Max had been suspended multiple times for fighting and bullying, but he's just misunderstood, she insisted. He's not violent. Suspensions for what exactly? James asked. Evelyn hesitated again, her grip tightening on the tissue. There was an incident with another boy and a dog. The school said he was being cruel, but they exaggerated. Kids don't know what they're doing sometimes. James noted her evasiveness, feeling a growing unease. Do you think Max is capable of hurting someone intentionally? Evelyn shook her head vehemently. Nathan, however, remained silent, his jaw tightening as he avoided eye contact back at her desk. Sarah reviewed Max's school records and found a disturbing pattern: multiple suspensions for bullying, reports of cruelty toward animals, and complaints from teachers about his manipulative behavior painted a picture of a deeply troubled child. James joined her, filling her in on the parents' responses. Nathan's in denial, but Evelyn knows more than she's letting on. He said they've been covering for him for years. Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. This isn't just about a troubled kid, James. This is something darker: the lack of remorse, the calculated way he talks about it. It's textbook psychopathy. James nodded grimly. But how do we prove it? And how do we protect anyone else he might target? As Max was escorted out of the interrogation room, his expression remained calm, even as Sarah walked alongside him to the juvenile detention center. She stopped him before he entered the transport vehicle. Max, she said softly, Do you understand what's happening now? Do you understand that this is serious?" Max looked up at her, his lips curling into a faint smile. He deserved it. He repeated, his tone as cold as ever. Sarah watched as the transport vehicle drove away, his words echoing in her mind. For the first time in her career, she felt truly unsettled, not just by the crime, but by the person who had committed it. As she returned to her desk, she couldn't shake the image of Max's face. The case wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about understanding the kind of darkness that could exist in someone so young. Do you think Max is the real killer? Is a 12-year-old really capable of such a heinous crime? Share your thoughts below and give this video a like if you're eager to find out how the story unfolds. The precinct was unusually tense. The morning after Max Turner's confession, reporters crowded outside, their cameras trained on the building as they jostled for sound bites. Inside, Detective Sarah Blake and her partner James Carter prepared for what felt like a brewing storm. The town was in an uproar, and the news of a 12-year-old committing such a heinous act had thrown the community into chaos. By mid-afternoon, a crowd had gathered outside the precinct holding signs that read, "Protect our children and justice for Alex's." Parents shouted in unison, demanding answers. Among the crowd, a visibly distraught woman yelled, "If a 12-year-old can do this, what's stopping another one?" Her words rippled through the group, amplifying their outrage. The anger wasn't limited to the precinct. A hastily organized town hall meeting drew a full house at the local community center. That evening, tensions were high as parents voiced their fears and frustrations. The mayor, seated at the front with Sarah and James, tried to calm the crowd. "We understand your concerns," he said, his voice strained. "I assure you, every effort is being made to ensure our children are safe." A man from the back shouted, "Efforts? My kid can't even play in the park anymore without me worrying he'll be next." The crowd erupted into a chorus of agreement, their voices echoing through the hall. Sarah, standing near the podium, clenched her fists. She understood the fear, but knew the answers they wanted couldn't come fast enough. As she glanced at James, he gave her a small nod, silently urging her to stay composed. While the town hall unfolded, Lisa Grayson's face dominated local news broadcasts in an emotional interview. She sat beside Alex's untouched desk, his favorite baseball cap resting on the edge. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke to the reporter. "Our children aren't safe," Lisa said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "The system isn't protecting them. My son is dead because no one saw the signs. And now the police want us to trust that they'll handle this. How can we trust anyone when the damage is already done?" Her words hit a nerve, resonating with parents across the city. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForAlex and #ProtectOurKids. The interview sparked debates about juvenile crime accountability and whether children as young as Max should be tried as adults. At the same time, Max Turner's lawyer, Stephen Gold, was crafting his defense. A seasoned attorney known for his skill in handling controversy IAL cases, Gold wasted no time spinning a narrative. "Max is a product of a broken system," Gold told reporters outside the courthouse. "He's a child with severe mental health issues, neglected by those who should have helped him. This isn't about punishment, it's about treatment." The community, already on edge, reacted with mixed emotions. Some agreed that Max needed help, while others saw the argument as an attempt to excuse his actions. The divide added fuel to the fire of an already volatile situation. After the town hall, Sarah spotted Lisa standing near her car in the dimly lit parking lot. Her posture was rigid, her arms crossed tightly as she stared into the distance. Sarah hesitated for a moment before approaching Lisa. Sarah called gently, "Can we talk?" Lisa turned, her face shadowed by the orange glow of the street lights. "What do you want, detective? More promises you can't keep. I understand you're angry." "Angry?" Lisa interrupted, her voice rising. "You think this is anger? My son is gone, Detective Blake. He's gone. And the person who took him from me isn't even old enough to understand what he's done." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We're doing everything we can, but justice doesn't happen overnight. You have to trust us." Lisa's laugh was cold, bitter trust. "I trusted the world to keep my child safe. And look where that got me." "Lisa," Sarah said firmly, "I need you to promise me something. Don't take matters into your own hands. Let us do our jobs." For a moment, Lisa said nothing, her eyes fixed on Sarah's. Finally, she spoke, her tone chilling. "If the law won't give me justice, "I'll find it myself," Sarah washed as Lisa got into her car and drove on off, a knot forming in her stomach. As she walked back to her own car, James was waiting for her. "How'd go?" he asked. "Not good," Sarah admitted. "She's on the edge, James. And I don't think we can stop her if she decides to jump back at the precinct." Sarah sat at her desk, scrolling through news articles and social media posts the community was tearing itself apart, some demanding harsh punishment for Max, others calling for systemic reform to address juvenile crime. It wasn't just about Alex anymore. It was about a city grappling with fear and anger, searching for someone to blame. James leaned over her desk, holding a cup of coffee. "This case is turning into a powder keg," he said. Sarah nodded, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "We need a breakthrough, James, something solid. Otherwise, this whole thing is going to explode." As the night wore on, Sarah couldn't shake Lisa's parting words. She knew all too well how grief could drive people to dangerous places. And with the community on edge, the stakes had never been higher. Detective Sarah Blake sat across from Dr. Evelyn Marks, a respected child psychologist whose expertise was often sought in cases involving young offenders. Dr. Marks had Max Turner's file spread out before her, her brows furrowed as she reviewed its contents. Sarah leaned forward, eager for any insight that could help her make sense of the boy's disturbing confession. "His behavior aligns with early signs of sociopathy," Dr. Marks began, her tone clinical yet tinged with concern. "The lack of remorse, the calculated nature of his actions, it all points to a profound inability to empathize." James Carter, seated beside Sarah, asked the question that had been nagging at both of them. Is this something he was born with, or did something push him to this point? Dr. Mark sighed, removing her glasses and rubbing her temples. "It's often a mix of both. Trauma, neglect, or even inconsistent discipline can exacerbate underlying tendencies. Max's file mentions trouble at school, incidents of animal cruelty, and a lack of meaningful friendships. These are red flags we often see in children heading down a dangerous path." "But can he be helped?" Sarah asked, her voice quieter than usual. Dr. Marks hesitated before responding. "He's not beyond help, but his lack of remorse is deeply troubling. Without some form of accountability or intervention, his fascination with power and control could escalate." Later that day, Sarah found herself in the sterile interview room at the juvenile detention center. Across from her sat Max, his small frame swallowed by the oversized chair. Despite the circumstances, he exuded a calm confidence that set Sarah on edge. "Hi, Max." Sarah began, keeping her tone neutral. "How are you doing?" Max tilted his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "I'm fine. This place isn't as bad as you'd think. They let me read. You know what I like reading." Sarah nodded, trying to keep him talking. "What do you like to read?" Max shrugged. "Stories about kings and battles, people who knew how to take control. They didn't let anyone tell them what to do." The comment sent a chill down Sarah's spine, but she pressed on. "Max, I wanted to talk about Alex. Can you tell me what happened that day?" Max leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. "Why do you care so much? Did you cry when he died?" The question hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She fought to keep her composure, but Max's piercing gaze seemed to see right through her. "I care because Alex was just a kid," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. "And so are you. You should be playing with friends, not sitting here." Max's smirk faltered for a moment, but then he leaned forward, resting his chin on his hands. "Friends are boring. Alex was different. He was easy." The casual way he spoke about Alex's death made Sarah's stomach turn. She ended the conversation soon after, leaving the room with a sense of dread that lingered long after the door closed. Posed behind her back at the station, James was waiting with new information. He held a folder containing journal entries recovered from Max's room during a search of his home. "You're going to want to see this," he said, handing it to Sarah. Inside were pages filled with erratic handwriting and unsettling drawings. One entry read, "Power isn't given, it's taken. People like Alex don't deserve it." Another described Alex in chilling detail, referring to him as the perfect test. Sarah flipped through the pages, her unease growing with each entry. "This isn't just a troubled kid acting out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is someone who's been planning, experimenting." James nodded grimly. It's like he was testing the waters, seeing how far he could go. Sarah set the journal down and rubbed her temples. "We need to understand what made him this way. If we don't, we're going to see him again in a few years. Only next time it'll be worse." Marks reviewed the journal entries with a practiced eye, her face unreadable. As she turned the pages, when she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with caution. Max's fascination with control and violence is deeply rooted. These aren't impulsive acts, they're calculated. He's curious, and that curiosity makes him dangerous. Is there any way to reach him? James asked. Dr. Marks hesitated. It depends on whether he's willing to acknowledge what he's done and why, but right now his focus isn't on remorse, it's on control. Every interaction, every question, he's using it to gauge your reactions. That's where he gets his power. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. So what do we do for now? Dr. Marks said. You keep him contained, but long-term he'll need intensive therapy, probably for years. And even then there are no guarantees. As Sarah sat at her desk later that night, she couldn't stop thinking about Max's words in the interview room. His smirk, his calculated questions, they all pointed to a child who understood far more than he let on. I'm going to dig deeper, Sarah said to James, who was sitting across from her, poring over more evidence. His past, his family, his school records. There has to be something we're missing. No one just becomes like this. James looked up, his expression a mix of exhaustion and resolve. You're right. If we want to stop this from happening again, we need to figure out what went wrong and how to fix it. Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what they would find, but she was determined to uncover the root of Max's darkness. For Alex, for the community, and for every other child who might one day cross paths with someone like Max. Sarah Blake sat in the quiet of her office, surrounded by files that painted a troubling picture of Max Turner's past. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became that Max's actions weren't just the impulsive outburst of a troubled child, they were the culmination of years of unchecked behavior. She combed through school records, disciplinary reports, and notes from counselors, piecing together a narrative of a boy who had repeatedly pushed boundaries only to face little to no consequences. Max had been suspended multiple times for bullying, yet his infractions always seemed to disappear from the official record. The reason? His father, Nathan Turner. James Carter arrived at Sarah's desk with a grim expression and a stack of papers. You're not going to like this, he said, placing the documents in front of her. Sarah scanned the top sheet, her eyes narrowing. A settlement, she asked, her tone incredulous. James nodded. 2 years ago, Max got into a fight at school, broke another kid's arm. The family was ready to press charges until Nathan Turner showed up with a lawyer and a fat check. Sarah leaned back in her chair, frustration simmering beneath the surface. So every time Max acted out, Nathan just threw money at the problem? Pretty much, James replied. I talked to a couple of former teachers. They said Max was a terror, picking fights, threatening kids, even pushing one down the stairs. But whenever they tried to take disciplinary action, Nathan would swoop in with donations or legal threats. Sarah's jaw tightened. He didn't just fail his son, he created this, determined to get answers. James and Sarah visited Nathan Turner at his sprawling suburban home. The man greeted them with his usual polished charm, but it quickly faded when James laid the settlement documents on the table. You've been cleaning up after Max for years, James said, his voice firm. And now a boy is dead because you didn't stop him. Nathan's face Rain, that's not fair, he snapped. I've done everything I could for my son. He's not a bad kid. He just made mistakes. Mistakes, Sarah interjected, her tone sharp. He's shown a pattern of violence and manipulation, and you've enabled him at every turn. Did you ever stop to think about the harm he was causing? Nathan's defensiveness wavered, replaced by a flicker of guilt. I thought he'd grow out of it, he admitted, his voice quieter now. He's just a boy. No, James said coldly. He's a boy who needed help, and you ignored every opportunity to give it to him. While James focused on Nathan, Sarah turned her attention to Alex's school. She interviewed teachers and classmates, hoping to learn more about the relationship between Alex and Max. What she discovered added another layer of complexity to the case. One teacher, Miss Holloway, described Alex as a kind and courageous student. He hated bullies, she said. Whenever he saw someone being picked on, he stepped in. Sarah nodded, taking notes. What about his interactions with Max? Miss Holloway's expression darkened. There was an incident about a month before Alex died. Max was bullying another boy, calling him names and pushing him around. Alex stepped in and told Max to stop. He didn't back down, even when Max got in his face. Do you remember what happened next? Sarah asked. Max stormed off, Miss Holloway replied. But before he left, he said something I'll never forget. You'll regret this. Sarah's pen paused mid-note. Did anyone report this? Miss Way shook her head. We didn't think he meant it. I wish we had armed with new information. Sarah returned to the station, her mind racing. She spread out her notes and began connecting the dots. Max's history of violence, Nathan's constant cover-ups, Alex's bravery in standing up to Max, and finally Max's chilling words. You'll regret this. James joined her, setting a fresh cup of coffee on her desk. What do you have? Sarah pointed to her notes. Max didn't kill Alex out of curiosity. She said he killed him out of revenge. James frowned, leaning over the desk. That changes everything. This wasn't just a crime of opportunity, it was planned. Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. Max targeted Alex because he stood up to him, and Nathan's influence gave him the confidence to think he could get away with it. The revelation added a new layer of urgency to the investigation. Sarah and James realized they weren't just dealing with a disturbed child, they were confronting the consequences of years of neglect and complicity. Max's calculated action showed a dangerous capacity for planning, and they needed to act quickly to prevent him from harming anyone else in the future. Sarah stared at Max's file, her jaw set. We're going to prove exactly what happened, she said, for Alex, for his family, and for every other kid Max is hurt. James nodded in agreement. Let's make sure he never gets the chance to do this again. As they prepared for the next phase of the investigation, both Detective Ives knew the stakes had never been higher. The case wasn't just about justice for Alex, it was about exposing the deeper failures that had allowed Max to thrive in his darkness. Lisa Grayson sat in her car, parked a block away from the Turners' stately suburban home. The engine hummed softly as she watched the house, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She had been here for hours, long enough to see Nathan Turner step out to pick up the mail, chat with the neighbor, and laugh as he carried a bag of groceries. Inside, each mundane moment fueled her anger. How could he carry on as if nothing had happened? Lisa's mind replayed the haunting image of Alex's empty bed, his room frozen in time, while Max Turner, the boy who took him away, slept comfortably in juvenile detention, protected by a father who had spent years shielding him from the consequences of his actions. Nathan Turner's office was a modern building in the city's financial district, its sleek glass exterior reflecting the setting sun. Lisa waited outside, her heart pounding as she rehearsed what she wanted to say. But when Nathan emerged, briefcase in hand, her rage surged, sweeping away any semblance of control. Nathan Turner, Lisa's voice cracked as she called out to him, arching toward him on the bustling sidewalk. He stopped, startled, then quickly masked his surprise with an air of indifference. Mrs. Grayson, he said coolly, glancing around, this isn't the place for you. Don't get to tell me what's appropriate. Lisa cut him off, her voice rising. You knew what Max was capable of. You knew. And you did nothing. Nathan shifted uncomfortably, trying to move past her. I'm sorry for your loss, but this isn't the time or place. Don't you dare to miss me, Lisa screamed, her voice shaking with fury. You paid off family silent schools and ignored every warning sign because it was easier than admitting your son needed help. And now my son is dead. Passers-by slowed their curious gazes, adding to Nathan's discomfort. This conversation is over, he said firmly, stepping around her and walking briskly toward his car. Lisa stood frozen, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face as she watched him leave. A concerned neighbor called the police after noticing Lisa's car parked outside the Turner house for several nights. The report quickly made its way to Sarah Blake, who knew Lisa's grief was pushing her toward dangerous territory. Sarah found Lisa the next evening at the cemetery, sitting on the damp grass in front of Alex's grave. The woman was hunched over, her hands trembling as she clutched a small photo of her son. Lisa, Sarah said softly, approaching with careful steps. We need to talk. Lisa looked up, her red-rimmed eyes filled with anguish. You're here to tell me to stop, aren't you? To leave the Turners alone? Sarah nodded, kneeling beside her. I know you're hurting. I can't imagine the pain you're feeling, but following them, confronting them, it's not going to bring Alex back, and it's not going to give you the justice you deserve. Lisa let out a bitter laugh. Justice? What justice? Max gets to live his life. Nathan gets to live his life. But Alex, her voice broke, and she pressed the photo to her chest. Alex is gone. Lisa's shoulders sagged, her voice a whisper. Do you know what it's like to feel this powerless, detective, to bury your child and know the system let him down? Sarah's throat tightened. I know the system isn't perfect, But taking justice into your own hands will only destroy your life too. Alex wouldn't want that. Lisa shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I'm his mother. It's my job to protect him. I failed him. Once I can't just stand by and do nothing. Sarah reached out, placing a hand on Lisa's arm. You didn't fail him, Lisa. You loved him, and you fought for him. But if you cross this line, you're not just losing Alex, you're losing yourself. Let me do my job. Let me fight for him. Lisa stared at Sarah for a long moment, the weight of her grief and anger visible in her trembling hands. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely audible. I'll stay away. As Sarah walked back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that Lisa's promise might not hold. The woman's pain was too raw, her anger too consuming. Sarah resolved to keep a closer eye on her, knowing that grief could drive even the most rational people to dangerous extremes. Back at the station, Sarah shared her concerns with James. She's hanging by a thread, Sarah admitted. If we don't get this case wrapped up soon, I'm afraid of what she might do. James nodded grimly. We'll get there, but we need to move fast. Max might be in juvenile detention, but Nathan Turner's influence is still a problem. He's not going to stop protecting his son. Sarah sighed, glancing at the stack of files on her desk. I just hope it's enough for Lisa's sake and for Alex. As the morning sun streamed through the precinct windows, as Sarah Blake sipped her coffee, the first moments of calm after a long night of reviewing evidence, James Carter entered the room with a file in hand, his expression grave. We got the DNA results, James said, setting the file on Sarah's desk. It's not Max. Sarah raised an eyebrow. What then? Who does it belong to? James opened the file, pointing to the report. It's a partial match to someone in Max's family, his older cousin, Evan Turner. Sarah leaned forward, flipping through the pages. Evan Turner's name appeared next to a record of violent incidents, our fights, restraining orders, and rumors of intimidation. Why wasn't Evan mentioned before? She asked, frustration creeping into her voice. James sighed. Nathan conveniently left him out, probably because Evans's history is a PR nightmare. Sarah and James made their way to the juvenile detention center. Max sat in the same interrogation room as before, his demeanor unchanged, aloof and calculating. Max. Sarah began placing the DNA report on the table. We found evidence that ties someone else to Alex's murder, your cousin. Even Max's smirk faltered for the first time. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, though his voice waved. James leaned in. We know Evan was there. The DNA doesn't lie, Max. But if you keep covering for him, it's only going to make things worse for you. Max's hands fidgeted in his lap. He didn't mean to, he started, then clammed up. Sarah's tone softened. Max, we need the truth. If Evan forced you into this, we can help, but you need to tell us what happened. The boy's composure cracked. Tears welled in his eyes. As he finally spoke, he made me do it, Max whispered. He said if I didn't, he'd hurt me too. Max's words spilled out in a rush. He described how Evan had come to him weeks before Alex's murder, spinning a twisted narrative about Alex being a problem that needed fixing. Evan used intimidation and fear to manipulate Max into luring Alex